Welcome back folks to the most ruthless of metal channels here on YouTube. And in today's video we're going to rank Accept studio albums from the worst to the best. Accept is a German heavy metal band. They formed back in 1976 by Wolf Hoffmann, Udo Dirkschneider and Peter Baltes. After Scorpions, Accept is the most popular hard rock or heavy metal act from Germany, and they've influenced a ton of bands around the world, including the North American thrash metal scene of the 80s, but also the birth of the European power metal scene in their own home country of Germany, with bands like Helloween, Gravedigger, Rage and Blind Guardian. So today we're going to take on Accept's discography, so without further ado, let's roll the intro. The worst Accept album is in my opinion 1989's Eat the Heat, and during this period Accept wanted to break the American market, and in order to do so they split with their charismatic frontman Udo Dirkschneider, and in stepped David Reece, and for me this wasn't a great decision. Accept were already becoming increasingly popular around the world, including in the United States, and this shift in frontman might have looked good on paper, with David Reece looking the part of elite 80s rockstar and all, and he's quite a competent vocalist as well. He reminds me a bit of Blackie Lawless or Wasp at times, but on the other hand, what was unique and different with Accept got lost in this change of frontman. Plus the songs here are more simplistic and a bit glammed up, kinda like a B-grade Motley Crue or something. But this was of course a sound and style that was popular when this album came out, so it wasn't a completely unexpected turn of events. Eat the Heat didn't do much for me. The production wasn't great and the songwriting was kinda lame too. And I don't think there is one song on this album that would qualify to be on any of their post-breaker albums. And I'm sorry to say this, but I just don't like any of the songs on this album. So that's why I rank Eat the Heat as Accept's worst. Next. In 15th place we have Predator from 1996, and this is the last Accept album to feature vocalist Udo Dirkschneider. And worth noting here is that Udo is sharing the vocal duties on several tracks with bassist Peter Baltes, who does a solid job here, but I do prefer Udo. After Eat the Heat that we just talked about, Udo returned to Accept to record 3 more albums before leaving the band again towards the late 90s. And those 3 albums were Objection, Overruled, Death Row and Predator. And these 3 are in a similar style, I would say. I mean, even the artwork looks kind of the same with the red logo on the black background. And I think this was something we trended in the 90s to make everything darker and heavier. And the production here has this 90s feel to it. One of the worst songs that Accept ever recorded is on this album, and it's called Primitive, a song with electronic drums, and it just sounds terrible, so stay away from that track. Predator is in my opinion a rather directionless album that tried to fit in with the trends of the time, but looking back on it, it just sounds dated and bad. Next. In 14th place we have Death Row from 1994, and this is another one of those mid-90s Accept albums that didn't impress me that much. But there are a few cool tracks on this album like Sodom and Gomorrah and Stone Evil that are worth checking out if you're new to this album. But the production values and the stiff and mechanical tone gives me a bit of a headache. There are however some great lead work on this album from Wolf Hoffmann, and the riffs are delivered in a typical Accept fashion. But this era of the band isn't anything that stands out in my opinion. This was also the last Accept album to feature longtime drummer Stefan Kaufmann. Next. In 13th place we have Accept's self-titled debut album, and this one is ranked quite low on my list, because the problem with a lot of the bands that the album debuted back in the 70s is that metal as we know it just didn't exist back then, so it took them a few albums to find their sound, which was kind of the case for Judas Priest and Scorpions as well. And Accept became more or less known as the Little Brothers of Scorpions when this album dropped, because this is more of a hard rock album with some rather catchy choruses, so it lacks a bit of balls to quote Accept themselves. It's just a meeker and more mellow Accept, but I don't think that this album is a complete train wreck though. The guitar work and the overall musicianship is quite enjoyable, but as I said, this is more of a 70s hard rock album. Next. In 12th place we have I'm a Rebel from 1980, and I consider this album to be Accept before they fully found their sound. But it's also a very different album from their debut. That one was a little bit more melodic and perhaps slightly more progressive. This one on the other hand is more simplistic and slightly more commercial, in an AC/DC kind of way. And speaking of AC/DC, Alex Young, brother of Angus and Malcolm, actually wrote the song I'm a Rebel, which became Accept's breakthrough song. And other songs worth mentioning here are Thunder and Lightning and Shine a Lady. And the album I'm a Rebel has its moments, but I still think that there was a long way to the top, to quote AC/DC. Next. In 11th place we have their latest studio album to date, which is Too Mean to Die. And ever since Accept released their 2010 comeback album Blood Nations, all Accept albums have sounded quite similar, much thanks to Andy Sneap's production and Mark Tornillo's voice. Mark is really the perfect fit for Accept. They just couldn't have found a better suited vocalist for this modern day era of the band, besides Udo himself of course. Too Mean to Die is a great album, maybe not an original album in any sense of the word, but it's made with the same formula as the band's last handful of albums. And this might not be a new Blood of the Nations or a new Stalingrad, but Accept always delivers solid, catchy and crunchy heavy metal, despite Peter Baltes leaving the band, which made Wolf Hoffmann the only original member left. Accept also decided to go down the Iron Maiden route here by adding a third guitarist in Philip Schaus. And the guitar trio shreds like crazy in the song Samson and Delilah, so check that one out. Next. In 10th place we have Objection Overruled from 1993. And this was the reunion album that brought Dirkschneider, Hoffmann, Baltes and Kaufmann back together again, for the first time since 1986 Russian Roulette. This album was in some sense a return to the classic Accept sound, after the band went in a more commercial direction with Eat the Heat. Objection Overruled was released in the middle of the grunge wave, and when Pantera brought metal in a new direction. But Accept remained steadfast and delivered an album that sounded like it could have been released in the middle of the 80s. I think that this was the best Accept album to feature u.d.o out of those three that the band released in the 90s. Objection Overruled might be a bit anonymous in their catalog, but it is a great album, so don't skip out on it just because it came out in 93. And there are lots of cool songs here, from the Teenage Rebellion in I Don't Wanna Be Like You, to the metal anthem Slaves to Metal. Next. In 9th place we have The Rise of Chaos from 2017. And worth noting here is that Herman Frank, who played on their last three records, was out of the band here, but they found a great replacement in Overruled, who played with Gravedigger in the 90s and Rebellion in the 2000s. So that was a perfect match, I think. The song Kool-Aid was a huge hit from this record, even if I find it to be a little corny. The Rise of Chaos, Die by the Sword and Analog Man are three cool songs here that are worth checking out if you haven't kept up with Accept lately. And these Analog Men are really delivering on a high level in this digital age. Next. In 8th place we have Blind Rage from 2014, and this is a great album. It's almost as fiery hot as the fire-breathing bull on the artwork. Love it. And the album kicks off with the up-tempo track Stampede, and it leads into Dying Breed. And that rhymes. And it's almost a perfect start of the album. Dark Side of My Heart is a bit calmer, but still a good song. And the heavy Fall of the Empire is another great tune. And I find the second half of the album slightly less interesting though, but as a whole, Blind Rage was another great album, and there was just no signs of the band running out of steam just yet. Next. In 7th place was Stalingrad from 2012, and I really like this album. This is metal done the right way. Great musicianship all over the board, great vocals, and a great production as well. And of course several great songs like Hung, Drawn and Quartered, Hellfire and Stalingrad. What a great song that is. And the anthemic Shadow Soldiers is also a brilliant track. And several of the songs here are about war and conflict, which makes the album perhaps even more current. And I really like Wolf Hoffmann's melodic leads on this album, and it feels a bit harsh for me to rank this as their 7th best record. But it's accepted we're talking about after all, and the quality of most of their outputs are on a real high level, and I actually think that Stalingrad is one of the best metal albums of the decade. Next. In 6th place we have Metal Heart from 1985, and this album was criticized a bit for not being as hard as some of their previous records, and there might be a slightly lighter tone to this album, which you can hear in the song Screaming for a Love Bite. It might have that 80s hair metal type of chorus, but I still think it's a great song. And I don't think that Metal Heart is any more commercial sounding than Priest's Screaming for Vengeance, for example. So I think that the criticism is a bit harsh here. The title track Metal Heart is cool with that Beethoven Fidelis melody. But my favorite track here is Midnight Mover, which I think is one of their absolute best songs. And I think that the album had the potential to be one of their absolute best. But there's just too many failures on here for this album to reach the top of my list. But it is a well produced and a great sounding record. And I do think that Metal Heart is more or less a must if you're a metal fan. Next. In 5th place we have Blood of the Nations, which I think is more or less equally strong as Stalingrad and Blind Rage. And maybe it's even slightly better than those, since I rank this as the best out of those 3 albums. And Blood of the Nations was Accept's big comeback album, after 14 long years of silence. And I remember there being some talk about this album when it came out, and the fact that Accept did a comeback album, but they didn't include u.d.o, and people were understandably a bit skeptic towards the new lineup. But as I said earlier, that Mark Tornillo was really the perfect match for Accept. So much that even the most hardcore fans have embraced the new era. And new to the lineup here was drummer Stefan Schwartzman, who had been drumming for Running Wild and u.d.o. And there are a ton of great songs here like Beat the Bastards, Teutonic Terror, Blood of the Nations, Time Machine and Pandemic. And these guys seems to write songs that can't foresee the future, whether it's war or pandemics. And this was a real comeback to form for Accept, and I hold this as one of the best comeback albums of all time. Next. In 4th place we have Balls to the Wall from 1984, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the band hit the peak of their popularity with this album. The title track Balls to the Wall was a monster hit, and without a doubt one of the biggest metal songs of all time, with its rather cheeky lyrics. And London Leather Boys is also a classic, Love Child is great, and Winners and Losers as well. It's just a great album overall. Maybe it lacked a bit of that speed and wildness of Breaker and Restless and Wild, but I think it's a more consistent album than, for example, Breaker, that is a bit all over the place. It's just one of those handful of records that belongs in every heavy metal fan's collection. And the album cover was also a bit weird, but the album is just a classic heavy metal album, and what's not to like about that? Next. In 3rd place we have Russian Roulette from 1986, and if Metal Heart was a slight move towards a more mainstream direction, Russian Roulette was more back to basics, back to that balls to the wall sound. And I think that this album is quite underrated, simply because it didn't have the big hit songs on it, like more or less all of their previous albums had. And maybe it doesn't have the same peaks as Metal Heart, for example, that I ranked lower than this album. But I do think that Russian Roulette is a much more consistent album with less filler tracks, And this album is just a pleasant ride from back to back, but it's not like the album is without great tracks. I do, for example, love the title track Russian Roulette, Aiming High and Heaven is Hell. And this was also the end of the classic era of Accept, since Udo Dirkschneider left the band after this album. And this record has this Russian theme to it, like we've seen in more recent eras of Accept, in an album like Stalingrad for example. So don't miss out on Russian Roulette, just because it might not have the big hit songs on it. In my mind, it's a very solid album, with a great production. Next. In second place we have Breaker from 1981, and after I'm a Rebel became a hit the previous year, Accept was back with a more metal sounding album. Yeah, I think that they finally found their sound and style with this album, even if there are still a few songs here that sounds a bit primitive, but on the other hand, there were a few songs that were ahead of their time too, like the song Breaker. It was just one of the fastest and heaviest metal songs back in 1981 when this album came out. Breaker is stuffed with memorable and heavy tracks like Starlight and Burning, but also more commercial tunes like Midnight Highway and the rather cheeky Son of a Bitch. And it was on Breaker that Accept stepped out of the Scorpions' shadow and came into their own. And it's without a doubt one of the most important European metal releases, and the proof that it wasn't just the Brits that could deliver some diesel-fuming heavy metal. Next. And the greatest Accept album is, in my opinion, Restless and Wild. And this album was certainly a wild one, and it must have been a shock when people heard the intro to Fast as a Shark for the first time, with that German u.d.o part that leads into the ear-piercing scream, and then the song kicks into a gear unheard of before it in metal. And Fast as a Shark was more or less a precursor to the thrash genre that was just around the corner. The next track, Restless and Wild, was equally great, fast with some amazing riffs from the Wolf Hoffmann himself. And we also have a song like Princess of the Dawn, which was a real Accept classic, and it was certainly played everywhere as well. And I also like the idea that they took the two guitars on the backside of Breaker and burned them. I thought that was a brilliant and cool idea for the artwork. And despite Accept having more or less 10 great releases under their belt, there was no question that Restless and Wild was going to be my number one. It's just one of the most groundbreaking albums of the 80s, and also one of the absolute best. So, let's have a look at my full Accept rank then. And this was another band that was hard to rank, because it really comes down to what you prefer, if it's the more consistent albums, or the albums with the highest peaks, but also the deepest valleys. Plus, it's kind of impossible to compare the old era with the new. I love both the Udo years and the Mark Tornillo albums as well. There are a few moments like Eat the Heat or some of their 90s albums that I wasn't that heavily into, but Accept is a band that has released like 10 great albums, and there aren't many other bands that have put out so much quality over so many decades. It's certainly impressive. And now I'm wondering if you have any Accept fans watching this video, and if you do, please post your favorite Accept albums down in the comment section, or rank their full discography if you're familiar with it. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe with the bell notifications turned on, so you won't miss out when I post more Ranking All videos here to the channel. And if you want to support my work, then there's always the option to become a Patreon, like the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Or you can always go and grab yourself some merch at the Ruthless Metal store. I also want to plug the Ruthless Metal website, where I posted around 100 different interviews from 2001 up until today. And it's from my old archives, and I have interviewed everyone from Testament to Sodom and Nuclear Assault. So check out the Ruthless Metal blog. And I'm also on Spotify, Instagram, Facebook and even Odyssey. And all the links are listed down below. And that's all for now, so let me know whose discography I should take on in the next episode of Rank 'Em All. And thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye bye.